Emma Lawson had spent her entire career building something that truly mattered. She was not a person who sought the spotlight, nor did she have any desire to be the face of the company she had painstakingly nurtured from the ground up. For years, she had deliberately kept her position as owner and CEO quiet, choosing instead to work among her employees, experiencing firsthand the environment she had worked so hard to cultivate. To most people, she was just another senior employee, someone with experience but no significant power, someone who showed up, did her job, and went home. And she preferred it that way. Emma had always been a private person, and the accident that had nearly taken her life a few years ago had only deepened her desire to avoid unnecessary attention. A devastating car crash had left her with permanent nerve damage in her right leg, forcing her to use an orthotic brace to walk. The pain was constant, but she had long since adapted to it, just as she had adapted to the world subtly shifting around her after the accident. People no longer saw her the same way. She could feel their hesitation, their unspoken assumptions, the way they instinctively underestimated her abilities. And while she had never been one to demand recognition, she resented being silently dismissed. Her company had been her refuge, a place where she was respected not for appearances but for results. The employees knew her as Emma Wells, a senior operations specialist who had been with the company for years. Her identity as the owner remained known only to the top executives, the board, and a select few. She liked it that way. It allowed her to observe how things truly ran without the artificial reverence that came with a CEO's title. She could see the small cracks forming before they became real problems, understand how policies impacted her employees without them sugarcoating their frustrations, and most importantly, it let her ensure that no one was being mistreated under her watch. But everything changed when Karen Miller walked through the doors as the new chief operating officer. Karen was a corporate bulldozer, the type of executive who saw people as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, who thrived on exerting power over others and eliminating what she perceived as inefficiency. She had been brought in under the pretense of streamlining operations, but Emma had dealt with enough Karens in her career to know exactly what she was dealing with. This was not about efficiency, it was about control. Karen had one goal: to consolidate as much authority as possible, reshape the company in her image, and eliminate anyone she deemed unfit for her vision. From the moment Karen took charge, Emma could sense the shift in the office atmosphere. The conversations grew quieter when Karen entered a room, employees avoided unnecessary interactions with her, and the energy that had once made the company an exciting place to work was slowly suffocating under the weight of Karen's relentless scrutiny. Policies became stricter, deadlines tighter, and flexibility, something Emma had always valued as a cornerstone of a healthy work environment, was now viewed as a weakness. Karen didn't just manage, she dominated. She demanded absolute adherence to her rules, and any deviation was met with immediate consequences. Emma remained under Karen's radar for the first few weeks, continuing to perform her job as she always had, observing carefully, taking mental notes of every questionable decision, and every unfair demand. But it didn't take long for Karen to set her sights on her. To Karen, Emma was an anomaly, a senior employee who didn't clamor for promotions, who didn't seek validation from upper management, and who, despite her experience, moved too slowly for Karen's liking. The first time Karen acknowledged Emma's presence in a meaningful way, it was in the middle of a staff meeting. Karen had been discussing productivity metrics and efficiency benchmarks, her voice sharp and unwavering as she listed expectations that were, by any reasonable standard, completely unsustainable. "We are not here to make excuses," Karen had said, her gaze sweeping across the conference room, daring anyone to challenge her. "We are here to perform. If someone can't keep up, they are no longer an asset, they are a liability. And I do not tolerate liabilities." Emma had seen the look in Karen's eyes as she spoke, the way her gaze lingered just a little too long when it reached her. It was not an accusation, not yet, but it was a warning, a statement of intent. From that moment on, the pressure began to mount. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Emma found herself left out of key meetings that she had always been a part of. Tasks that had once been delegated fairly were suddenly piling up on her desk, stretching her workload beyond what was reasonable. Her requests for resources or clarifications were met with cold indifference or outright dismissal. And then came the more direct attacks, the quiet comments disguised as helpful advice, the pointed remarks about expectations and standards. One morning, as Emma was reviewing reports at her desk, Karen had approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been looking over the department's efficiency reports," Karen said smoothly, sliding a folder onto Emma's desk. "And I couldn't help but notice that your productivity metrics are, well, below the standard we're aiming for." Emma arched an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. It was an interesting choice of words. Productivity metrics. Not performance, not results metrics. Numbers that could be manipulated to tell whatever story Karen wanted them to. "I've been in this company long enough to know that numbers don't always tell the whole story," Emma replied evenly, closing the folder. Karen's smile sharpened. "That's the problem, Emma. You've been here a long time, maybe too long. I need people who can keep up." The words hung in the air like a threat. Emma could feel the eyes of nearby employees discreetly watching, pretending to be focused on their work but listening intently. Karen wanted her gone. That much was clear. But what Karen didn't know was that she had just declared war on the one person who had the power to end her career with a single signature. Emma didn't react. She didn't argue, didn't push back. She simply smiled, nodded, and went back to her work. She had learned long ago that power was not about who could shout the loudest. It was about control. And right now, Karen thought she had control. She thought she was the one making the decisions, the one who held Emma's future in her hands. But soon, she would learn the truth. Emma was not just another employee. She was the foundation of this company, and Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Emma glanced down at the folder on her desk, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface. Let the game begin. Emma had always believed that the worst kind of enemy was the one who thought they had already won. Karen Miller was precisely that type of person. She strutted through the office with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance, the kind of corporate executive who had learned how to manipulate systems and people to her advantage, mistaking fear for respect and compliance for loyalty. She operated with the assumption that she could dictate the fate of anyone she deemed unfit, that she could weed out the weak and reshape the company in her image. And for a while it seemed as though she was succeeding. The changes in the office were gradual but undeniable. People spoke in hushed tones, careful about who might overhear their conversations. The employees who once collaborated freely now second-guessed every decision, afraid that stepping out of line would put them in Karen's crosshairs. The once welcoming atmosphere of the company was slowly suffocating under the weight of an unspoken fear. Meetings became tense, as Karen's expectations grew increasingly unrealistic. Late nights at the office became mandatory, but unacknowledged. The pressure to perform at inhuman levels became the standard, and those who faltered, those who struggled under the sudden and relentless demand for perfection, were quietly replaced. Emma watched it all unfold, her every instinct screaming at her to step in, to put an end to it before it spiraled further out of control. But she wasn't ready to reveal her hand just yet. She needed Karen to believe she was winning. She needed her to feel comfortable in her assumption that Emma was powerless. And so, she played along. She allowed Karen to see what she wanted to see: a woman slowly being pushed out of her role, a weak link being exposed, a liability waiting to be removed. Karen, in her arrogance, took the bait. The first real blow came in the form of an email. A sterile, impersonal notification informing Emma that her position was being reevaluated as part of the company's ongoing restructuring efforts. The wording was deliberately vague, offering no concrete reasoning, no specific infractions or failures. Just a subtle warning, a quiet nudge toward the exit. Emma sat at her desk, rereading the email, a slow smile spreading across her lips. It was almost amusing, really. Karen must have truly believed that this would be enough to send her packing, that a simple email would intimidate her into resignation. It was a classic corporate tactic: push someone into feeling unwanted, make their work environment unbearable, and hope they leave voluntarily to avoid confrontation. But Emma had no intention of making it that easy. She closed the email without responding, leaning back in her chair as she considered her next move. Karen was getting impatient. That much was clear. The subtle tactics weren't working fast enough for her liking, so she was escalating, trying to force the issue. That meant Emma didn't have much time before Karen took the final step, the one she had been anticipating from the very beginning. And sure enough, it came just a few days later. It happened without warning. One moment, Emma was wrapping up her reports for the day, her mind focused on the numbers in front of her, and the next, her computer screen went black. She frowned, reaching for her mouse, assuming it was some sort of glitch, but nothing responded. She tried restarting the system, but the login screen rejected her credentials. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she reached for her phone, quickly checking her company email. Access denied. A shadow loomed over her desk. "Emma, I need to see you in my office." Karen's voice was light, almost casual, but there was a smugness underneath it that set Emma's teeth on edge. She didn't respond immediately. She simply stood, grabbed her notepad out of habit, and followed Karen through the office. She could feel eyes on her as she walked, employees pretending not to watch but clearly aware that something was happening. The whispers would start soon, if they hadn't already. Karen's office was pristine, almost sterile in its organization, every detail meticulously arranged to project an image of control. She gestured for Emma to sit, but Emma remained standing, meeting Karen's gaze with quiet patience. "There seems to be a problem with my access," Emma said calmly, as if she didn't already know where this conversation was headed. Karen folded her hands neatly on the desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, I had it revoke your credentials this morning. You won't be needing them anymore." Emma arched a brow. "Is that so?" Karen sighed, as if she were dealing with someone particularly slow. "Emma, let's not make this difficult. We both know this isn't working out. I've reviewed your performance and frankly, it's not at the level this company needs. You've been here a long time and I respect that, but times are changing. I need a team that's agile, efficient, and capable of keeping up, and unfortunately you just don't fit that vision." Emma said nothing. She let the silence stretch between them, let Karen squirm under the weight of it, her confidence wavering ever so slightly when Emma didn't react the way she expected. Karen had been prepared for anger, for indignation, maybe even desperation, but not for indifference. "Your severance package is generous," Karen continued when Emma still didn't speak. "You'll have plenty of time to figure out your next move. There's no need to drag this out, Emma. Let's just be professional about this." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Professional," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "Like revoking my access before even speaking to me? Like sending a termination notice through an impersonal email?" Karen's smile was tight. "I didn't think there was much to discuss." Emma exhaled softly, shaking her head. "You're making a mistake, Karen." Karen laughed, the sound light but laced with condescension. "I don't think I am." Emma studied her for a moment, then reached for the folder in front of her, flipping it open. She skimmed the document briefly, lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've already filed this paperwork with HR," she noted, tapping her fingers against the page. "Of course. I wanted to make sure everything was in order before speaking to you," Karen replied smoothly. Emma nodded, closing the folder and setting it back on the desk. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. "Emma," Karen called after her, amusement creeping back into her voice. "Don't be bitter about this. It's just business." Emma paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Of course," she said simply. "Just business." And with that, she left. She didn't go back to her desk. She didn't stop to speak to anyone. She walked straight to the elevators, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. Karen thought she had won. She thought she had successfully eliminated the weakest link. What she didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that Emma wasn't just another employee. She owned the entire damn company. And Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Emma walked out of Karen's office with measured, steady steps, her face giving nothing away. The office was eerily quiet, a tension hanging in the air as employees pretended not to glance in her direction. She could feel their eyes, their curiosity barely concealed behind forced expressions of focus, and she knew the whispers would start circulating the moment the elevator doors closed behind her. Karen had done this publicly for a reason. She wanted to send a message. She wanted everyone to see that no one was untouchable, that even senior employees could be discarded at her whim. She wanted fear. Emma let her walk away momentarily, thinking she had it. She reached the ground floor, exiting the building without a word, but she didn't go home. Instead, she made a call as she walked across the parking lot, her voice calm and composed as she spoke into her phone. Start the audit. I want everything: financial records, hiring contracts, client reports, internal memos. If Karen signed her name to it, I want it on my desk before the end of the day. She didn't wait for confirmation before ending the call. There was no doubt it would be done. She had prepared for this. Karen had assumed she was playing a game against an opponent too weak to fight back, but Emma wasn't fighting, she was dismantling. By the time she arrived at her secondary office across town, the wheels were already in motion. She had established this space years ago, a discreet location where she could operate away from the daily chaos of the main building, somewhere she could work without being under constant observation. It was where she handled the aspects of the company no one else needed to see, where she made decisions without interference. Her assistant, Daniel, was already waiting when she walked in. He took one look at her face and didn't bother asking questions. It's done. It's flagged every major decision Karen made since she started, and we're running cross-checks now. But there's more. You need to see this. He handed her a tablet, the screen displaying a summary report. Emma's eyes skimmed the text, her fingers tightening slightly as she absorbed the information. Karen hadn't just been restructuring, she had been redirecting funds, subtly shifting resources to areas that didn't make sense, creating bottlenecks in departments she had deemed unimportant. More than that, she had been fast-tracking approvals for external contracts, bypassing standard oversight to push deals through without the usual scrutiny. Deals that, on the surface, looked like routine vendor agreements, but, when traced back, had concerning connections to companies with a history of financial misconduct. Emma's expression didn't change, but something in her posture hardened. She's not just consolidating power, she's setting up a play for control. Daniel nodded. It looks like she's positioning herself to make a case for executive restructuring. If she can manipulate the financials to make it seem like the company is struggling, she can push for an emergency vote to remove you from the board. Emma set the tablet down, exhaling slowly. She's trying to take the company out from under me. Daniel hesitated. If she convinces enough people on the board, she might actually pull it off. Emma leaned back, her mind already piecing together the next step. Karen was good, ruthless, methodical, and confident enough to believe she had already won. But she had made one critical mistake. She had assumed Emma would react like everyone else, scared, defeated, desperate to hold onto her job. She had no idea she had been playing into Emma's hands the entire time. She stood, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the past few hours. Schedule a meeting with the board. Tonight. I want every voting member in the room. Daniel blinked. That's not going to be easy. Some of them are out of town. Then tell them to get on a plane. Emma's tone left no room for argument. And put Karen on the invite list. I want her to think she still has control of the narrative. Daniel didn't ask questions, he just nodded and got to work. Hours later, Emma walked back into the main building, stepping through the doors with a presence that sent a ripple through the office. Karen had wanted an audience when she fired her, had wanted everyone to see her humiliate the weakest link. Now Emma would give them something else to watch. She walked past her old desk without a glance, straight toward the executive wing. No one stopped her. No one dared. She pushed open the boardroom doors without knocking, stepping inside just as the last few members were taking their seats. Karen was already there, sitting confidently near the head of the table, her expression flickering with brief surprise before settling back into cold amusement. "Emma," she said smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "I wasn't expecting you. I assumed you'd be busy planning your next career move." Emma took her seat at the far end of the table, placing a folder in front of her. "I thought I'd save that for later. We have more important things to discuss." Karen arched a brow. "Like what?" Emma slid the folder across the table. "Like why you've been funneling company funds through shell contracts. Why you've been fast-tracking vendor approvals without oversight. Why you've been intentionally restricting department resources to create artificial losses on the quarterly reports." The room went silent. Karen's face remained impassive, but Emma could see the subtle shift in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw, and the way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around the armrest of her chair. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emma leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Don't insult me, Karen. I have the paperwork. The only reason I haven't already turned it over to legal is because I wanted to see how far you were willing to take this game." Karen's smile was thin, forced. "This is ridiculous. Whatever you think you've found, I assure you." Emma cut her off. "Save it. I already know your endgame. You were never just cleaning house. You were setting up a corporate coup. You wanted to weaken the company just enough to justify restructuring, then push for my removal under the pretense of financial mismanagement. Once I was out, you would have had free rein to redirect assets, cut whatever deals you wanted, and position yourself as the new CEO." Karen's eyes flickered, just for a moment. The smallest crack in her carefully constructed mask. Emma sat back, giving her a moment to absorb the weight of her failure. "You underestimated me, Karen. You thought you were playing against an employee fighting for a job. You didn't realize you were trying to the person who built this company from nothing. And you really didn't realize just how much leverage I have." Karen's expression darkened, but she forced a smile. "So what now? Are you going to fire me?" Emma smiled, slow and deliberate. "No, Karen. I'm going to let you bury yourself." She gestured toward the board members, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence. "You see, I don't need to fire you. The damage is already done. The contracts you approved? Illegal. The financial reports you manipulated? Fraudulent. And the best part? I didn't have to do a thing. You signed everything yourself. You left a trail so obvious that by the time legal is done reviewing it, your only concern will be how lenient the prosecution feels." Karen's face lost a shade of color. Emma stood, straightening her blazer. "Be effective immediately. You're on administrative leave. I suggest you use the time to find a good lawyer." She turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back with one final, satisfied smile. "Oh, and Karen? This wasn't just business. This was personal." She left the room, the weight of victory settling over her. Karen had walked into this battle thinking she was in control. She had spent weeks chipping away at Emma's authority, certain she was erasing her from the company. But in the end, she had only succeeded in destroying herself. Karen had always prided herself on her ability to anticipate obstacles before they arose, to manipulate people and situations with a level of precision that ensured she was always in control. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, carving out her reputation as a woman who didn't make mistakes, who didn't leave loose ends, who knew exactly how to pull the right strings at the right time. And yet, as she sat alone in her office, staring at the official notice of her administrative leave, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Panic. She had underestimated Emma. That much was clear. What she had assumed was just another disposable employee, another piece of dead weight slowing down progress, had turned out to be something far more dangerous. She had been maneuvering against the one person in the company who had the power to destroy her. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She had built her entire career on one fundamental rule. When backed into a corner, you don't retreat. You strike harder, you hit first, you make the other person second guess whether they ever had the upper hand to begin with. Emma may have forced her into a temporary setback, but Karen had no intention of going down without a fight. She didn't waste time dwelling on what had already happened. Instead, she picked up her phone and started making calls. She had spent months cultivating relationships within the board, whispering doubts about Emma's leadership into the right ears, planting seeds of uncertainty that, given the right circumstances, could be turned into full-blown distrust. This was just a setback. Nothing more. The battle wasn't over. Meanwhile, Emma was already 5 steps ahead. She knew Karen wouldn't take her suspension quietly. People like her never did. She had seen it before: those who thrived on control, who couldn't tolerate even the idea of losing, who would rather burn everything to the ground than admit defeat. That was why Emma hadn't been content with simply sidelining her. She needed to make sure Karen had no way back in. The legal team was already deep into their investigation, dissecting every document Karen had ever touched, combing through records, contracts, and emails. Emma had no doubt they would find more than enough to justify termination, but she wanted something stronger. Something that would leave Karen with no room to maneuver, no angle to exploit, no possible way to salvage her career. She needed proof of intent. Numbers could be explained away. Oversights could be dismissed. But deliberate fraud? That was something else entirely. Emma spent the next 48 hours locked in strategy meetings, working with internal auditors, legal experts, and trusted advisors. She wasn't just looking to fire Karen. She was preparing for the inevitable lawsuit Karen would try to launch in retaliation, the wrongful termination claim, the attempt to spin herself as the victim of corporate politics. She had no intention of letting that happen. By the time she walked back into the office, 2 days after Karen's suspension, the entire company was buzzing with speculation. Some employees avoided looking at her entirely, afraid of aligning themselves with the wrong side. What's ici a Mozilla Boldstrans? Others nodded in silent approval as she passed, relieved that someone had finally done something about the growing toxicity Karen had brought into the workplace. Emma didn't stop to acknowledge either group. She had work to do. She stepped into the conference room where the legal team had gathered, dropping into the chair at the head of the table as a thick file of documents was placed in front of her. "We found something," one of the lawyers said, flipping to a specific section of the report. "It's worse than we thought." Emma glanced over the paperwork, scanning the highlighted text. A series of transactions, all routed through secondary accounts that had no legitimate business purpose. Contracts signed with third-party vendors that, upon further inspection, didn't actually exist. Payments authorized by Karen under department budgets that should have required multiple approvals, yet somehow went unnoticed. It wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was embezzlement. Emma let out a slow breath, closing the folder. "Send everything to the board," she instructed. "I want them fully briefed before the next meeting. And alert security, I want her access permanently revoked." Karen wasn't just losing her job, she was losing everything. But as much as Emma wanted to believe that the hardest part was over, she knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. And she was right. Hours after the evidence was presented to the board, Karen made her move. A press release went out, one that Emma hadn't authorized, one that immediately sent shockwaves through the company. It was a carefully crafted statement, written in a way that painted Karen as a dedicated executive who had been unfairly targeted in a corporate power struggle. She framed herself as the victim of a calculated smear campaign, claiming that she had only been trying to enact necessary reforms and that her suspension was nothing more than retaliation from those resistant to change. The damage control team was on it within minutes, but Emma knew the timing had been intentional. Karen had set the narrative before Emma had a chance to respond. And worse, she had allies. Several board members who had previously remained silent now started voicing concerns. Not outright support for Karen, but enough hesitation to make it clear that she had gotten to them. That she had managed to make them question whether removing her was the right decision. Emma didn't react publicly. She didn't issue a statement, didn't call for an emergency meeting, didn't scramble to counter Karen's version of events. She simply waited. Karen had made a mistake. She had assumed that Emma would panic, that she would react impulsively, that she would try to shut her down as quickly as possible. What she hadn't realized was that Emma had already anticipated this. While Karen had been making phone calls, trying to rally support, Emma had been doing the one thing Karen never thought to do. She had been listening. She had spent the past several days meeting with employees, not just executives, but the people who had been directly impacted by Karen's leadership. The ones who had suffered under her policies, who had been silenced or dismissed, who had been forced out simply for not fitting into her vision of efficiency. And she had documented everything, in every complaint, every resignation letter, every testimony from employees who had been wrongfully terminated. So when she finally did respond, she didn't do it with corporate jargon or carefully worded PR statements. She did it with truth. She called a company-wide meeting, something that hadn't been done in years, something that made it clear that this wasn't just another executive dispute. It was something that affected everyone. And when she spoke, she didn't hold back. She laid out the facts, the financial discrepancies, the unethical practices, the harm Karen had caused not just to the company but to the people within it. She didn't need to spin a story. She didn't need to craft a narrative. She just told them what had happened. And when she was done, she watched as the uncertainty in the room shifted. Karen had tried to frame herself as the victim, but the truth had dismantled that illusion. The employees didn't just see Karen for what she was. They saw Emma for who she was. Not just a leader, not just an executive, but someone who had been fighting for them all along. And Karen? She had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. Karen sat in the dim light of her high-rise apartment. The city sprawled beneath her like a breathing entity, pulsing with a rhythm she could no longer control. Her glass of wine, untouched, rested on the sleek black marble of her coffee table, condensation forming a small ring around its base. She had spent years perfecting the art of staying ahead, of manipulating people and systems to bend to her will, of ensuring that when the dust settled, she was always the one standing. And yet, for the first time in her career, she was the one being hunted. Emma had done something she never anticipated. She had turned the game against her with brutal precision, using facts, not politics, to dismantle everything she had built. The company-wide meeting had been the turning point. The moment Emma had laid out the truth in front of hundreds of employees, exposing Karen's calculated moves as not just ruthless leadership but outright corruption, the tides had shifted irreversibly. What should have been a strategic retreat for Karen had become a full-blown collapse. But Karen was not the kind of woman to accept defeat. She had built her career on adapting, on finding new leverage when the old ones failed. And if Emma wanted a war, Karen would give her one. She turned back to her laptop, scanning the latest developments from her legal team. The initial plan suing for wrongful termination had already been shredded by the weight of the evidence Emma had gathered. There was no denying the financial manipulation, the redirected funds, the shell contracts. The paper trail was too strong. Any attempt to play the victim now would only make her look desperate. But that didn't mean she was out of options. She needed chaos. A distraction big enough to shift attention away from herself and onto something else. Something that would destabilize Emma's position before she could solidify it further. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The line clicked after the second ring. "Hello, Karen," a male voice said smoothly. She leaned back into her chair, exhaling slowly. "I need something buried, and I need it done fast." The next morning, chaos erupted. A series of anonymous reports flooded corporate inboxes, each one filled with carefully fabricated allegations about Emma's leadership. Claims that she had misused company funds, that she had engaged in unethical hiring practices, that she had forced out employees under questionable circumstances. Every email was sent from untraceable accounts, designed to stir doubt, to create fractures within the foundation of trust she had built. The strategy was simple. If Karen couldn't save herself, she would make sure Emma burned with her. Emma arrived at the office to find a storm brewing. The board was already convening, their discussions tense, their faces a mixture of concern and skepticism. The accusations were nothing more than noise, baseless fabrications thrown into the wind, but Karen had timed them well. The company was still in a fragile state, reeling from the revelations of her misconduct. The last thing they wanted was another scandal. Emma sat through the meeting, listening to the murmurs of uncertainty, the carefully worded questions designed to test her composure. "Emma, we need to be sure that we aren't trading one problem for another," one board member said, his voice measured. "These reports, whether they hold any truth or not, are already damaging our public image. We need to consider all possibilities." Emma folded her hands on the table, her gaze steady. "You mean you need to consider whether I'm worth backing?" A murmur passed through the room. No one wanted to confirm it, but she had hit the mark. Karen had played this move well. She hadn't needed proof. She had only needed doubt. Emma could have gone on the defensive, could have started refuting every false claim one by one. But that would have been playing into Karen's hands. The more time spent proving her innocence, the more it looked like there was something to prove. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and let the silence stretch. "How many of you received these reports directly?" she finally asked. Several board members exchanged glances. A few raised their hands. Emma nodded. "And how many of you have seen any real evidence to support them?" No one moved. "Exactly," she continued, her tone calm but unwavering. "These accusations are nothing more than a last-ditch attempt to destabilize leadership. And the fact that they were dropped in your inboxes just days after Karen's suspension tells you everything you need to know about where they came from." A few board members shifted in their seats, realization dawning. Emma didn't stop there. "I spent years building this company from the ground up. I have been here through every success, every failure, every turning point, and I will not waste my time defending myself against baseless claims orchestrated by someone who has already been exposed as a fraud. If you want to entertain these distractions, that's your choice. But I have real work to do." She stood without waiting for a response. The meeting ended shortly after. By the time she returned to her office, she already had Daniel waiting for her. "We traced the source," he said, handing her a folder. The emails were routed through multiple servers, but they all originated from the same network. Karen didn't even try to hide it that well. Emma flipped through the pages, scanning the data. It was all their timestamps, IP addresses, digital fingerprints that pointed directly back to Karen's known associates. Emma closed the folder. "Release it to legal. Let them handle it." Daniel hesitated. "You're not going to retaliate?" Emma looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said simply. "She's already buried herself. I don't need to push her deeper." But Karen wasn't done. That night, she made one final move, a lawsuit. Not against the company, but against Emma personally. Defamation, corporate sabotage, professional misconduct. The allegations were ridiculous, but Karen didn't need them to stick. She only needed them to make noise. And for the first time, Emma felt exhaustion creep in. Not because she was afraid, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she was tired of playing this game. Karen didn't care about winning anymore. She just wanted to make sure Emma lost with her. But Emma wasn't going to lose. She made one call. Not to the board, not to legal, not to anyone within the company. She called a name that Karen never saw coming, someone outside of their corporate world. someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And within 24 hours, Karen's world collapsed in ways she hadn't even prepared for. Because while she had been so focused on taking down Emma, she had forgotten one crucial rule. There was always someone watching, and Karen had made enemies far worse than Emma along the way. Karen had always believed that power belonged to those who took it. She had built her career on that philosophy, climbing the ranks with calculated precision, eliminating obstacles before they had the chance to become real threats. For years, it had worked. She had orchestrated corporate takeovers, restructured entire departments, and forced out executives who had stood in her way. She had perfected the art of survival, and even now, even after everything Emma had thrown at her, she refused to believe that this was the end. She still had leverage. The lawsuit had been a desperation move, she could admit that much. But desperation didn't mean defeat. It meant adaptation. She had learned long ago that the corporate world was not about playing fair, it was about playing smart. And if she couldn't win in the boardroom, she would win in the courtroom. The legal battle alone would be enough to stain Emma's reputation, to make investors question her leadership, to create just enough hesitation to open a window for Karen to climb back through. Except that window never came. Because Emma hadn't been fighting alone. Karen had known that Emma was resourceful, that she had connections, that she was capable of pulling together evidence and strategy faster than most. But what she hadn't accounted for was the fact that Emma had an entirely different kind of ally, one that wasn't bound by corporate politics, one that had been waiting for an excuse to take Karen down. The first sign of trouble came the morning after Karen had filed the lawsuit. A call from her lawyer, his voice tight, controlled, but carrying an undertone of something she wasn't used to hearing from people who worked for her. Fear. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. Karen barely glanced up from her laptop. "Then fix it." "It's not that simple," he continued. "We just received a request for financial disclosures. Not just for your dealings with the company. They're looking into your personal assets, offshore accounts, secondary holdings." Karen sat up straighter. "That's not part of the lawsuit." "It is now," he said grimly. "Someone's pushing for a full investigation into your financial activities. And it's not just internal. There's government involvement." Karen's stomach tightened. This wasn't Emma's doing. Emma played by the rules. Emma used policy and corporate structure to fight her battles. But this was something else. This was someone going straight for the jugular. Karen ended the call without another word. She needed to move quickly. If someone was digging into her financials, they were going to find things she didn't want found. The kind of things that didn't just cost people their careers. The kind of things that led to indictments. She started making calls. First to her usual contacts, the ones who specialized in making problems disappear. But every number she dialed went unanswered. Every message she sent was ignored. Someone had cut her off. She switched tactics, reaching out to the board members she still had sway over, trying to leverage what little influence she had left. But they were hesitant now, avoiding direct answers, reluctant to be seen aligning with her too closely. The walls were closing in. By the time she walked into her lawyer's office later that afternoon, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The lawsuit had been a trap, and she had walked straight into it. "They have enough to open a case against you," her lawyer said the moment she sat down. "Embezzlement, tax fraud, wire fraud. If you don't settle, this is going to trial. And if it goes to trial, you're going to prison." Karen's mind raced, already running through possible exits. She had to negotiate. She had to make a deal. There were always deals to be made. "What do they want?" she asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Karen," he said slowly, "they don't want money. They don't want a settlement." She frowned. "Then what?" He exhaled sharply. "They want you to admit guilt, publicly. They want you to sign over your remaining shares in the company, withdraw your lawsuit against Emma, and issue a formal statement taking full responsibility for everything. No negotiations, no counteroffers. Take it or go to prison. Karen stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. That wasn't a deal. That was execution. And she knew exactly who was behind it. Emma. Emma had never intended to fight Karen in the courtroom. She had set the boardroom trap, let Karen scramble, let her think she was still a player in the game, while all along she had been orchestrating something far worse. She hadn't just beaten Karen, she had erased her. For the first time in her life, Karen felt it. The slow, creeping realization of absolute, undeniable defeat. There was no escape this time. No power moves left to make. No one left to protect her. And so, 2 days later, in a press conference watched by every major business outlet, Karen Miller stepped up to the podium, the weight of her own downfall pressing against her lungs as she read the prepared statement. Her voice was steady, but she felt hollow as the words left her mouth. I take full responsibility for my actions. My decisions were unethical, and I deeply regret the impact they have had on the company, its employees, and its leadership. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing all legal action and resigning from my position permanently. She finished reading, lowering the paper slightly. And then she looked directly at Emma, standing in the crowd. Emma didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just watched, silent, unmoving, as the final remnants of Karen's power crumbled around her. Karen turned away, stepping down from the podium, ignoring the reporters shouting questions, ignoring the cameras flashing, ignoring the murmurs of former colleagues and board members who no longer had any use for her. She walked out of the building and into obscurity. Emma stood in the same spot for a long moment, watching Karen disappear into the streets beyond. Then she turned and walked back inside. There was still work to do. The world moved on quickly after Karen Miller's downfall, as it always did in corporate circles. Scandals that seemed monumental in the moment were quickly buried under the next wave of headlines, the next executive shake-up, the next financial report that dictated the mood of the market. Within weeks, Karen was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a name spoken in hushed tones by those who had once admired her rise and now feared sharing her fate. But for Emma, the aftermath was more than just a change in leadership. It was a reckoning. The company had survived, but survival wasn't the same as recovery. The damage Karen had inflicted on morale, on trust, on the very foundation of the workplace was deeper than Emma had initially realized. Employees were still wary, still hesitant, still watching every move with the quiet suspicion of people who had been burned before and weren't eager to let it happen again. It wasn't enough to remove Karen from power. Emma had to rebuild what had been lost. Her first decision was to remove every trace of Karen's influence. Policies that had prioritized fear over productivity were dismantled. Managers who had thrived under Karen's cutthroat mentality were reassigned or removed entirely. The company's internal structure was rewritten, not just to undo the damage but to ensure that no one like Karen could ever manipulate the system again. But the hardest part wasn't restructuring the company. It was repairing the trust of the people who made it run. Emma knew she couldn't ask employees to believe in leadership again, just because the biggest threat had been removed. Trust wasn't restored by policy changes or corporate memos. It was built through action. So she started small. She made herself visible, not as the CEO dictating orders from behind closed doors, but as someone who walked the same halls, sat in the same meetings, listened to the same concerns. She made it clear that the company wasn't just returning to what it had been before Karen, it was becoming something better. Some employees were quick to embrace the change, relieved that the nightmare was over. Others took longer, waiting to see if this was just another shift in power that would lead back to the same old problems. Emma didn't blame them. She had spent too many years watching how leadership could fail its people to expect blind faith now. But slowly, things began to shift. The atmosphere in the office changed. Conversations weren't whispered anymore. The employees who had once been afraid to speak up started voicing ideas again. Laughter returned to break rooms that had once been silent. The tension that had clung to the walls since Karen's arrival began to lift. And with that change came something Emma hadn't expected: a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just fighting to keep things from falling apart. She was building something. Something real. Something lasting. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Emma sat in her office, the soft hum of the city beyond the windows filling the quiet space. She glanced at the stack of papers on her desk: reports, contracts, memos, then pushed them aside. Instead, she reached for the single folder she had left unopened for days: Karen Miller's final resignation letter. She read it slowly, taking in every word, every carefully crafted sentence meant to preserve what little dignity Karen had left. It was hollow, just like the woman who had written it. A desperate attempt to maintain control, even as she was losing everything. Emma closed the folder and set it aside. Karen was gone. The company was hers again. And for the first time, that felt like enough.